And joining us now in studio, Marci McDonald, author of The Armaggedon Factor, The Rise of Christian Nationalism in Canada. Nice to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Pleased to meet you. Now, why don't we just start by having you sort of state the case, the premise behind the book about the religious right and its influence in politics today. Go ahead.
State the case always makes it sound as if I have written some polemic, that I am defending some position that I'm laying out with great controversy in my wake.
Well, you do have a view on this, Marci.
Well, actually, I have less of a view than a reporter's job that I've done. Okay. It's the first book that's been written on what I saw was a growing phenomenon in Canada. No one else was writing about it. I first wrote about it for the Walrus magazine in 2006. And 4 years later, it's now grown into a book, and much has happened in that time. But it had struck me when I moved back to Canada from the United States, many years in Washington, both as Maclean's bureau chief and later for U.S. Magazine, that I was suddenly hearing during the same-sex marriage debate here the sort of rhetoric that I thought I'd left behind in Washington over religious and social values issues. Most people in the mainstream media, it seemed to me, just assumed those voices had disappeared when the legislation went through, and the Christian right leaders who were most outspoken apparently disappeared from the scene. In fact, as I discovered, they dug in, they had laid down organizational roots, quite sophisticated organizational roots in Ottawa.
Well, they recalibrated, waiting for another day.
And they were determined that they would not have the same kind of defeat ever again.
The thing you are putting inverted commas around, telling us to watch out for, hasn't really got that far forward, because the Prime Minister, who's supposed to be an evangelical Christian, has put the brakes on at the key moment.
He wants a majority, and he knows, unlike in the United States, you can't get a majority, or you can't call the evangelicals or conservative Christians really in this country, because our religious right is much different than that in the United States. There are far more Catholics in this country. He can't get a majority. He can't call those people his base the way George Bush could. It's just a numbers game. So he must walk this uneasy tightrope that I don't think, as what I'd call a cerebral Christian, I don't think as a cerebral Christian he really wants to go in some flaming religious direction.
Who's the cerebral Christian, him or you?
He is.
He is, okay.
I think that's what he's been called. And I think that he's more comfortable with economic conservative policies. He realized when he took over the Alliance that he needed all of these social and religious conservatives, and he was, until relatively recently, throwing them tidbits. SOPs, they called it, and they were not happy with him. And they said, we'll stay home in the 2008 election. It's not clear whether or not they did, because so many people stayed home.
But you seem to be suggesting that the second he gets his majority government, in comes this right-wing social conservative movement, which will be perfectly at home with this government and, you know, sort of march us on the road to a theocracy. Is that what you're saying?
No, that isn't actually what I'm saying, because I think that's not his nature. Now, a successor to him, who is more committed to this movement, a successor such as Stockwell Day, might have a different agenda. I think Tom Flanagan, who often speaks for Stephen Harper,
has more. He gives him advice through the media, but I don't think he.
Well, trial balloons
okay.
too. I think that he has said Harper would naturally govern from the center, or the right of center, as he would say. But we have seen more recently in all these defunding moves, defunding the Eco Justice Group, Kairos, defunding women's groups, and the G8 initiative, much more overt initiatives to this particular constituency, and it comes in the wake of the tremendous criticism he's received from economic conservatives.
So here's the question. So what? What's wrong with that?
And perhaps nothing at all. And if you've read my book, you know I'm not saying there's anything wrong. I listened for 4 years.
Okay, you keep talking. I'm going to find the passage.
I listened for 4 years to conservative Christians telling me they could not get covered by the mainstream media. They did not have their voices represented in politics. I think there's a point at which I think, first of all, voices of faith and people of faith should be represented in the political process. I mean, there's a history of it. Tommy Douglas, all sorts of people. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. I think when you use religion and social values issues as a party building strategy, as a wedge issue to divide one kind of Christian against another, against faith against one another, you have opened a Pandora's box, and you're headed in the direction of the Tea Party movement.
But here we are on page 353. Just so you know, I got past the introduction, okay? For those hardcore believers who expected Stephen Harper to roll back same-sex marriage and enshrine fetal rights, he has been a major disappointment. Even the Evangelical Fellowship has noted the, quote, lack of policy gains on his watch. And I could go on. I mean, it sounds like the thing, and I know you say you don't have a view on this, but I mean, and okay, maybe you didn't write the...
I'm not saying I don't have a view. I'm saying that I'm not representing some crusade against people of faith having a voice in politics. And I think what we're seeing is, when I wrote that, he had not made as many moves as he has in the months since.
Okay, but he's the most, I think it's probably fair to say, he's the most evangelical prime minister we've ever had, and he's a huge disappointment to the evangelical movement. And if that's the case, do people who don't want this country moving closer to a kind of a socially conservative agenda in their public life, do they really have that much to worry about?
I don't know whether they do. That's up to them to decide, but it's important that somebody write about this, I think, connect the dots. It isn't just in government policy. Tremendous changes are being made in the organization of the public service, in the organization of the courts, the choosing of judges. There are a lot of fundamental directional changes that never appear in a bill before Parliament, never get debated. And those few moves that he's made, such as the film tax credit funding bill that was slipped into a taxation housekeeping bill, and obviously you cannot call that open. It was covered. It got all the way to the Senate before a watchful lawyer discovered it. I mean, if the mainstream media is either not covering it or not equipped to cover it, because I can't imagine an overtaxed bureau chief in Ottawa assigning some reporter on a Saturday to a Christian conference where there happened to be all these MPs and claims made. Yeah. I just happen to have the luxury of time. I connected the dots. People can do with it what they may.
Okay.